Great. So it looks like we're up, we're live streaming, and really, really great to do this event with all of you. Please bear in mind this is my and ELCE's first time doing this. So please bear with us as we get started in 30 seconds. Great. So here we are live. Thank you all for joining us both on the Zoom webinar as well as those joining us live streaming from YouTube. I've got a really exciting presentation for you today. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. All right. So as I mentioned, thank you so much for joining our webinar. This is ELCE's Clean Energy Webinar 2020. I'm Brodie Yyelland, your host. I'm the Executive Director for the Emerging Leaders for Clean Energy. And I've got a really exciting presentation for you today. So thanks a lot for joining in. I hope you really enjoy it. So our agenda for today, we've got a lot of exciting items. First of all, I'm going to just quickly talk about who am I and why you should listen to me. I'm going to go through the ELCE organization quickly to tell you about who we are and what we do. Next, we'll get into the actual content of our webinar today. One is the clean energy overview. Then we'll get into specifics about wind power, hydropower, solar power, and finish it off with a talk about energy storage. At the very end, we're going to do a question and answer period. At this time, I'd like to just announce some housekeeping items. If you're joining us from Zoom, please submit your questions through the Zoom app. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. If you submit these questions or you see a question that you think you'd like answered, you can upvote that question so that at the end of the presentation, I know which ones more people want to be answered. If you're joining us from the YouTube live stream, please feel free to engage in chat on the chat. Unfortunately, we may not have time to get to all the questions on the YouTube chat, but please feel free to chime in there with your fellow viewers. So to kick things off, I just quickly want to talk about myself and what I do currently. So I'm involved with two organizations. One is the University of Calgary, and the other one is the Emerging Leaders for Clean Energy. At the University of Calgary, I'm a sessional instructor, and I teach two courses. One is Physics 371, which is an introductory course. We call it Energy for Everyone, or Introduction to Energy. It's an elective course to teach students about energy, how it's used, where it comes from, and what the impacts are. I also teach a course called Science 529. This is a final year project course, mainly for engineers, but anyone in the natural sciences environmental program. In that course, I teach mainly about solar energy, and we do a really interesting final project where I get students to design their own solar energy systems. Also at the University of Calgary, I'm a full-time student. I'm working on my PhD in environmental design. I'm looking at low carbon development of urban districts. Moving over to the Emerging Leaders, I joined this organization in 2014, right after I started working with Skyfire Energy. Since then, I've moved from a chapter volunteer into a director, and just recently, a few months ago, I was voted in as the executive director for the Emerging Leaders for Clean Energy. And I couldn't be more excited to be leading this organization. I've got a lot of exciting things planned for this organization. This event is just the kickoff. Just a quick quote here about our organization. ELCE is a growing network of young professionals, students, and clean energy advocates who are working together to build a clean energy future for all people. The important points here, we're a growing network. We focus on young professionals, students, and we're trying to build a clean energy future for all people, not just our own communities, but for all people. So ELCE is a Canadian registered not-for-profit organization. We work in 3 areas, 3 pillars of our organization. One is projects, the next is education, and the final one is professional development. So I'm going to go through these quickly here. On our projects, just want to highlight, we identify and support community projects that otherwise wouldn't either go ahead or just need our support. One is the SOS Children's Village. This was a hospital in Nepal that was having a lot of issues with electricity. They couldn't refrigerate their medicines. The lights would go off in the middle of the night while they're delivering babies. So our energy system, partnered with Sun Farmer, is able to provide them with reliable energy. Another project that we're proud of is the Pitzpan Solar Project. This is an Indigenous focused project, which we were very happy to be involved with. If you want any more information about our projects, please go to our website, elce.ca/projects. On the education side, of course, one of the things we do is webinars. This is our first one, but we also do a lot of events across Canada, events like Solar 101s or panel discussions about clean energy. But we also have a project that I'm personally very proud of that I led for the last 2 years, is our K-12 solar education project. This project puts resources in teachers' hands that they need no prior information about, and they're able to teach their students about solar energy in a way that connects with the actual learning outcomes for their curriculum. If you want any more information about that project, please, again, go to our website, elce.ca/education. And finally, professional development. ELCE is really focused on empowering and developing the next echelon of clean energy leaders. The way we do this, one is through our mentorship program, linking professionals with up-and-coming students and young professionals. But we also have a thriving campus clubs program. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about our clubs. I'm going to highlight a few and talk about how you can get involved if you're interested. So ELCE clubs. Now, before I begin, you might think it's a typo because ELCE in the top left is spelled ELSE instead of CE. Now, this is a legacy item. Originally, ELCE was formed as the Emerging Leaders for Solar Energy. But over the last year, we've broadened our horizon to include all forms of clean energy. Our clubs are still focused on solar, but they're considering whether they want to branch out into all other forms of clean energy. Some of the things that our clubs are up to, if you can see on the pictures here, these clubs are raising funds, developing clean energy projects. In the top left, you see the Garden Shed project in Calgary, where they raised funds and put a solar energy system on the garden shed to provide power to any of the gardeners at that location. In the bottom left, you can see a solar energy tour where students were able to go and tour a project. This one's a little special to me because that was actually one of my projects. I helped sell and develop and design that 50 kilowatt system operating just south of Calgary. In the bottom right, you can see a solar cart. One of our groups raised funds and developed this solar energy off-grid cart, which is really amazing. All the components to be a mobile solar energy system. I actually use this cart in my class, and it's really great. You can pump some tunes, charge laptops and cell phones, really great project. Finally, in the top right, you see a photo from our Carleton Club in Ottawa, where they've finished construction of their greenhouse and are now just sourcing solar energy system to put on their greenhouse and start producing clean energy. If you're interested in joining one of these clubs, if you're a student at University of Calgary or Carleton University, please, there's the links to contact them directly if you're interested in joining up. I know especially Carleton is looking for more volunteers. If you're not part of one of these clubs or don't live in Calgary or Ottawa, we really urge you to start your own club. ELCE facilitates the creation of these clubs. We have a structure in place to make it very easy and streamlined for you to set up your own club. We can give you a draft constitution and support you as best we can. Keep in mind, though, that all of our ELCE clubs are self-run and really, as the national organization, we're just there to support them and empower them. Finally, before I get into the actual content of our presentation, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to our sponsors for this event. Without these companies, we wouldn't have been able to pull off this event. Those companies are Baywa Renewable Energy and Skyfire Energy. Baywa Renewable Energy, they're a global clean energy developer as well as a distributor. As you can see here, they employ 2,400 people globally. They have 82 locations across 26 countries, and they have quite a high turnover rate in 2019, also operating in Southeast Asia and Australia. Baywa is a good solution for any clean energy project that you're thinking of. Also would like to highlight Skyfire Energy. Thanks again for your sponsorship. Skyfire Energy is actually where I got my start in the clean energy field. I moved to Calgary for a job with Skyfire Energy in 2013, and I know the company very well. Skyfire has actually been installing solar energy systems since 2001, which was really in the dark ages of clean energy. Since then, they've really expanded, and they're now one of Western Canada's leading solar energy contractors. They've got 200+ years of experience. They've done over 1,000 systems. They're a certified B corporation, and they also run an employee ownership model. So big thank you to Skyfire Energy. I wish you the best. All right, we're right on schedule. For the next 45 minutes, I'd like to talk about clean energy. To start off, we're going to talk about a clean energy overview, looking at a snapshot of how clean energy is doing in the world right now. The first graph I'd like to show, this is electricity generation costs. Now, this is a global average. Of course, these costs would change based on the geography and a lot of other factors, but this is a global average. And the big takeaways from this graph is that solar and wind have dropped below any other type of generating source. I've also added the hydro figure, which is also just slightly lower than solar. So these three sources, hydro, solar, and wind, are now the cheapest ways to produce electricity worldwide. But you might ask the question, what is stopping us from completely transitioning to wind and solar? And one of the answers for this, which I'll touch on at the end of this presentation, is energy storage. Wind and solar, although very cheap when they're producing energy, are also intermittent. They're not schedulable, and this makes some issues for electrical grid operators. So although these figures show that these sources are very cheap, wind and solar specifically suffer from this intermittency problem. And that's why the energy storage side is a big topic right now. I'd also like to talk about this graph. There's a lot going on, but I want to show you what the status is globally when we're comparing renewable energy to non-renewable energy. What you can see on this graph is gray bars and blue bars. The gray ones are the capacity added or new generation for non-renewable sources. The blue ones are capacity added for renewables. And what we can see is that right around 2012, 2013, we see an inflection point. And we see that at that point, renewables are being installed at a higher rate than non-renewable sources. In fact, if we fast forward to 2019, we see such a drastic comparison between renewables and non-renewables. The red line there is just showing the share of renewables. So in 2019, more than 70% of the new electricity generation installed was renewable sources. This is a really, really uplifting and important indicator to show where the industry is going and what sources are being developed right now. If you want to take a look at the breakdown based on different types of renewable sources or clean energy sources, I've got a couple graphs here showing the figures for 2018 and 2019. In 2018, we saw a fair dominance, maybe 50% of the added capacity was solar and wind. And then in 2019, we see that even greater. The solar and wind make up almost 75% of all capacity added to the grid in 2019. Again, really great indicator to where the industry is going. I want to make a comment at this point, however, because these figures are being posted in terms of capacity. And it's really important to distinguish between the capacity of a plant and the actual energy that it produces, because various different types produce different amounts of energy. So to capture that type of information, we have a factor, and we call that the capacity factor, which, if you see the equation there, is just the actual energy output divided by the maximum possible energy output. It's akin to maybe efficiency, but it just tries to capture the fact that not all of these sources are generating energy all the time. Even if they have a 2 megawatt capacity, they're not operating at maximum capacity all the time. So one of the outliers you can see here in purple is nuclear, which most nuclear plants are designed to be base load, and they're designed to operate basically at peak output all the time. The only reason they're not 100% is because they have to be refueled. Next on the graph here, we have coal and natural gas combined cycle. They're still fairly high capacity factors. Coal especially is a baseline type of generating system, which tries to operate most of the time. Over on the right, though, we see our clean energy sources. We see hydro, solar PV, and wind. And specifically looking at solar and wind, we see their capacity factors are around 25% and 35% respectively. So keep this in mind. I teach this in my classes as well, to really make sure that you're understanding any figures that you see about capacity added. Thinking about how if a solar plant, say a 1 megawatt solar plant is being installed, it's only going to be operating on average about 25% of the time. So these figures that I've shown you before are a little skewed because, yes, solar and wind have a large capacity, but their capacity factor is quite low still. And that's why, again, energy storage is a really important thing to develop these resources. I want to give you a snapshot of electricity generation in Canada. Yes, there's a lot going on this graph, but what you see here are the different types of energy generation in Canada, and the size of the circles represent how large those systems are. It's fairly interesting to take a look at this graph and see where, for instance, hydropower is being produced. We see a lot, obviously, in BC. We see a little bit in Manitoba, and then primarily, a lot of our hydropower comes from Quebec, so much so that we sell a lot of it to the United States. You can see on the flip side, the coal and natural gas production is heavily favored over in Alberta and Saskatchewan. We've got a lot of large coal plants, a lot of natural gas, and that makes sense. You develop that resource where the resource is. I just wanted to show you as well this mix from NRCan of the total energy that Canada is producing. Now, again, as I just introduced, this is now energy, not capacity. So this is the actual amount of electrons that are moving and serving Canadian customers. We see a dominant hydro portion 60% of Canada's electricity comes from hydro. Nuclear is still at 15% in second. That's largely due to the sites in Ontario. We still have a large contingent of coal. However, we should see this number go down, especially in Alberta with the retirement of coal plants. And at 7%, we see this non-hydro renewables, which captures wind, solar, and other non-hydro renewables. We'd like to see that number grow. Of course, this graph hasn't updated to show any prospective projects. We should start to see some solar, some yellow dots appear in Alberta. I'm very excited to see those dots show up. So let's get into the first category that we're going to cover, and which is wind power. Wind energy generation globally versus Canada. On the global scale, we see a pretty linear increase year on year, that more and more wind is being installed. Keep in mind that the small gray, lighter gray portion on the top is offshore wind, and the larger portion is onshore wind. I thought this was kind of interesting. I used to think that offshore must dominate the market, but it's really, again, in its infancy stages. And we're going to talk about some interesting technology that should see that share increase. Here in Canada, we see a fairly steady increase in wind. Just want to note that these graphs are not on the same scale, and that the peak of Canada production only represents 2.5% of the global energy production for wind. Quick basics of how wind power works. Wind power converts the energy of the momentum from wind into mechanical power. The spinning blades convert that energy into mechanical power. And just like any other regular generating station, as soon as you have rotating power, you can produce electricity. So that mechanical power is converted into electrical power with a generator and is sent onto the grid. Looking at the evolution of wind power over the years, it's very interesting to see that bigger is better. And that's not just because if you build twice as big, you get twice as much energy. In fact, with wind, the bigger you go, it's an exponential curve, because the larger your rotor is, if you think about the equation of a circle, pi r squared, for every unit that your rotor is increased, it's that unit squared for the total area. So what we're seeing is really a drastic increase in that swept area, the size of our turbines. I had a question before this about asking, what about residential or commercial scale wind? Why don't we see wind power on our buildings, in our backyards? One thing to think about here is that, first of all, wind is likely never or should never be attached to a building or structure. That's because of vibrations. I've heard stories of people with wind on their houses that it shakes their entire house. But the larger factor is about light flicker and about sound. Wind turbines are just not suited for urban areas. They're just not suited for areas where people are operating and living every day. So unless some new technology comes across, we're not going to see a lot of wind power going up in urban settings. I wanted to highlight quickly just the one wind project in Canada. This is a farm in Ontario, and this is Canada's largest wind farm to date. It's 270 megawatts. It has a series of 124 turbines. Each of those are at 2.3 megawatts, kind of in that middle range. This project serves up to 100,000 homes in Ontario, but takes up 68,000 acres. Wind, above basically any other generation source, takes up the largest amount of land. However, that land can still be useful, as you see in these photos, for farming, for agriculture, and for grazing. Compare that to, say, solar energy, where it gets a little more tricky to also use the same land for something productive. Finally, about wind, I wanted to introduce a new project, a new design that I think is very interesting. This is the ELCE. This is the newest generation turbine coming in from General Electric. It has an offshore focus, although the photo you see there on the left has it planted onshore. The scale there, this wind turbine is almost as tall as the Eiffel Tower. It's got a 12 megawatt capacity. Compare that to the project I just told you. Those turbines were 2 megawatts. This one is 12. It's massive. The 220 meter rotor, 220 meters, that's the length of 2 CFL football fields. It's just enormous. They're also claiming that the capacity factor is 63%. Now, of course, offshore wind has a higher capacity factor. If you remember earlier in the presentation, I showed that on average, wind is only 35%. But this turbine is claiming factors of up to 63%, which is very exciting. And just to note, this is being produced in Saint-Nazaire in France. All right, so we're going to jump into our next subject, which is hydropower. So on the global scale versus Canada, these graphs aren't really that interesting. We see globally a slight increase in projects, and in Canada we see a bit of a flat curve. Again, want to make sure you realize that these graphs are different scales, and that Canada's maximum output is only 9.3% of the global output. Globally, we can see the graph slightly increasing as maybe underdeveloped countries start to develop their natural and good hydro resources. But in developed countries like Canada, we're not going to see a lot of hydropower come online simply because most of the great sites are taken already. It's really tough to find a great hydropower source that's also close to where you need the power. Of course, in northern Canada, there's lots and lots of other great hydropower potential projects, but they're just too far away from where that energy is needed. I want to talk about the differences between the two main types of hydroelectricity generation. One is called basically a hydroelectric dam, and the other, maybe you've heard of this, is called run of river. Looking at the hydroelectric dam for a second, you can see that we have a big dam, a reservoir. This is probably what you think of when you think of hydropower. It's good to note that the amount of energy that you can produce in this dam is based on the distance between the turbine and the top of the reservoir. That distance, it's called head, dictates how much pressure and how much energy you can produce with that turbine. Once you get the turbine spinning, just like other generation sources, you've got mechanical spinning power, you hook that to a generator and you produce electricity. Now, the difference with run-of-river systems, which are considered to be a lot more environmentally friendly, they don't work on using a dam per se. You can see at the top of this diagram, you have the intake and an intake weir, which is called a low dam, which is a dam such that it allows, say, salmon spawning to still travel up and down and doesn't significantly impact the flow of that river. What it does is it siphons off just a portion of that river flow. It puts that river flow in a pipe called a penstock, and as it flows down several hundred meters at least, hopefully, you get to the power station where the turbines are located. You still have a large distance in terms of head, but you're not disturbing that river flow as much as you would with a typical dam site. We're hopefully going to see more of these systems come online, and this could be the future of more hydropower development. Chapter 4, we're talking about solar energy. Similar graph that I showed you before, the global versus Canada picture. This is energy generation. Again, reminding you this is energy production, not capacity. I really like to see this global curve. It's not just linear, as we saw maybe with wind. This is more exponential. Solar energy production and generation is increasing exponentially. There's no denying that. We see a similar curve here in Canada, but a reminder that although this graph looks promising, we're still only 0.7% of the global solar energy generation. This graph shows similar figures, but in a different way. This breaks it down in terms of different regions of our Earth. We've got Europe, America, Asia Pacific, China, and then Middle East and Africa. And if you notice on this graph, very interesting to see that around 2011 to 2014 or 15, Europe dominated the solar capacity market, mainly due to Germany and Italy. Germany producing and installing a lot of solar PV, whereas Italy was installing a lot of solar thermal, using the thermal aspect of solar energy to produce power. However, around 2014 or 2015, we start to see a switch, and we really start to see Asia and China dominate that market. Speaking of China dominating the market, this is the current solar capacity by country. And of course, the standout here is China, operating 32% of global solar capacity right now. If we were to back up again, back to 2011, we would see Germany and Italy dominate this graph. But now that other countries have caught up, we see China in the lead, and then we see USA, Japan, Germany, and India following suit. What I expect to see from this graph in the future is India, Japan, and USA both growing significantly, and we'll likely see Germany fall off because they've really developed a lot of their resource already. Want to touch quickly on the solar PV farms in Canada. Now, a lot of these are located in Ontario. A lot of the top ones, the top maybe 6 or 7 here, are all in Ontario. However, we're starting to see Alberta projects and Western Canada projects come online, including the Cochrane solar energy system. So, however, these 100 megawatt systems might seem large. Keep in mind that across the world, systems are being installed 10 times this size. We're seeing systems in China being installed at 1,000 megawatts or 1 gigawatt, which is amazing. Want to talk a little bit about the basics of PV systems and underscore basic, because solar energy is different. Solar energy doesn't require or rely on any mechanical energy. What we see here is a solar array producing energy that goes to an inverter. You might ask, what's an inverter? What does that do? Something that you should know is that solar energy and solar panels produce what's called direct current. Now, if we were in a fight between Tesla and Edison, this could go on for a long time. Eventually, Tesla won, and alternating current is what we use today. When you plug in your phone, when you plug in your laptop, you're plugging into alternating current. So in order to use that energy from the solar, we have to install an inverter. We have to change it from direct current to alternating current. The inverter does a lot more than that, and essentially conditions that power to match what's being produced by the electrical grid. And finally, trying to get into the basics of how a solar cell works. Just going to touch on this briefly. I could probably teach an entire course about this, but the main things to take away. Number one, sunlight and light in general is composed of both a wave and a particle, and that particle is called a photon. You can picture a photon as a light speed particle flying in and striking your solar panel. When that photon comes in, it has a chance to excite or transfer its energy to an electron. You can imagine a bolt of lightning striking the electron, making it much more energized, such so that it leaves its atom and wants to travel. This is how generally we're producing energy. But the trick is with solar energy, with solar PV cells, is all about that junction between our negative and our positive silicon. If you just have one type of silicon, you're not going to produce any energy. I'm not going to get into all of the fundamentals about this, but just take away the fact that all of that energy production, all of the business happens right at that junction between our negative silicon and our positive silicon. I had a question from one of our Zoom viewers beforehand about asking about emerging PV technologies. This is a great question, and I love it. I wish I had time to cover all of the exciting emerging technologies in PV. However, that's probably a great topic for a future webinar. Some of these technologies include multi-junction cells. You see here in the diagram, there's just one junction. However, you can layer multiple layers of silicon or other substances to make multi-junction cells, which are typically much more efficient, but much more costly. There's also a lot of research going into different materials, things like perovskite, quantum dots, gallium arsenide, a whole list of different types of materials other than silicon that are allowing us to increase that efficiency of our solar cells. Finally, I'm going to talk about energy storage, and I saved this for last because it might be the most important subject that I talk about today. In fact, it is. Quickly looking at the global snapshot for energy storage, we see that it's slightly increasing. However, 2019 did see a decrease. I won't get into all the details, but it happens to do with South Korea and some of their issues with their battery technologies. The graph is split up between behind the meter and grid scale. Now you might understand what grid scale, that's kind of utility size. Behind the meter essentially means battery systems that are going in people's houses, in businesses, and that are serving a specific house or company directly. We're seeing a lot of behind the meter installations going on in Japan. And in North America, mainly led by the Tesla Powerwall, we're seeing some of that increase as well. I want to talk about different battery types and highlight a few of them. The first one, which I hope you've heard of, is called lead acid. And yes, it's exactly what you think. It's a battery composed of lead and sulfuric acid. These batteries, you're going to see them in your car. And up until maybe 5 or 10 years ago, these were primarily the battery technology for solar energy systems. 5, 10 years ago, if you were installing an off-grid solar energy system, say on your cabin in a remote location, you would also have to order a truckload of lead acid batteries. These things are heavy, they take up a lot of space, and they don't last very long. Another battery technology, which I'd like to highlight, is more of a future-looking technology, although it is installed in lots of applications now. It's called a redox flow battery. This battery sets itself apart from other batteries because it doesn't actually mix any of the components within the battery. Redox flow consists of one large tank of a positive electrolyte and one large tank full of a negative electrolyte. And it produces electricity simply by pumping them past each other. They don't mix, they mix through what's called a membrane, a proton exchange membrane. Won't get into the details, but there's a lot of exciting things being talked about redox flow because it's essentially infinitely scalable in terms of just build a larger tank. And it doesn't suffer from the degradation or corrosion issues that most other batteries suffer from. Maybe one of the drawbacks, is that redox flow really doesn't work on a smaller modulo scale, although I have seen some of those systems being put in. But you might have guessed the outlier and the main one that we're talking about today is lithium ion. Just recently, the founders and developers of lithium ion technology won the Nobel Prize, and for good reason. This type of battery dominates our market. Lithium ion is in your phone, it's in your laptop, and now it's also providing energy storage for our vehicles, for our houses, and on a utility scale. If you watch the stock market, you might have seen that Tesla's stock is starting to skyrocket. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that. Of course, their car company is doing well, but it's been speculated that a lot of that has to do with their utility battery side of their operations. Speaking about utility scale batteries, I want to highlight this one. This is the Hornsdale Power Reserve. This is currently the world's largest battery. Now, I say battery in terms of an electrochemical battery. There's lots of other ways to store energy, but this is the largest electrochemical battery, 100 megawatts, 129 megawatt hours. This battery system installed in Southern Australia is connected to a wind farm. So number one, it's allowing to store that energy from the wind farm and be able to use that at a later date. This small, looking like small energy system serves 50,000 homes in Australia. And like I mentioned, it's using lithium ion technology by Tesla, essentially the same type of batteries that are going in your Tesla car. It all boils down to a little AA sized battery, but in this case, there's going to be thousands or millions of them stacked on top of each other. Another interesting thing to talk about with this project, it's a showcase, and it's demonstrated that not only is this good for the environment to utilize renewable sources more fully, but it's also economical. And I've read different sources stating that this project broke even within 2 years, or is scheduled to. That's almost unheard of when you talk about renewable energy projects. Solar power, you're looking at 10 to 15 years, depending on your location. This system is breaking even probably in about 2 years. The reason for that is not because it's storing all that wind energy, but it's because Tesla has also developed an automatic algorithm which is embedded in this system, which automatically buys and sells energy at the most profit. So these systems are not only allowing us to store our energy, but they provide a really, really important service when it comes to electrical grids. I want to just quickly explain why. Our electrical grids are very finicky. If you're an electrical grid operator, you have a stressful job. And that's because when I turn on a light, I immediately need that energy. In light speed, I need electrons to my house. It's the job of the grid operators to be able to provide and ramp up and ramp down that energy to provide that to their customers. So things like coal and nuclear do the baseline, but then we have plants like, they're called natural gas peaking plants, that ramp up and ramp down to serve the demand whenever it's needed. That ramping up and ramping down is not really the most economical way to do it. These battery systems allow for almost instantaneous ability to ramp up and ramp down our energy provision to the grid. This is a really, really vital component, and that's why there's a lot of these types of projects being planned and in development. I'd like to just quickly talk about Elon Musk's bet. If you're not familiar about this particular project, Elon Musk bet that he could install 100 megawatts of energy storage in 100 days, and he won that bet. And the reason I'm pointing it out is that 100 days is really, really small amount of days to install something that has such a big impact on their electrical grid. Not only is it economical, but it can be installed modularly and efficiently. So there's a lot of exciting things happening on the battery side. Want to touch on batteries in Canada. You might be asking, well, Australia is one thing, but what about here in Canada? What are we doing with utility batteries in Canada? I want to highlight one project that's going up in southern Alberta. It's called the Wind Charger project. This project is a lot smaller, only 10 megawatts or 20 megawatt hours of energy, but it's also connected to a wind farm, the Pincher Creek Wind Farm in southern Alberta. This site, which you can see in the picture there, can power the entire town of Pincher Creek, which has about 3,600 residents, for 90 minutes. It's not necessarily designed as backup power, but it shows you the scale of just these 6 small buildings can provide to an entire town or small town. Again, these are lithium ion by Tesla, and really a test bed for how this type of technology will work in Canada. We've got the demonstration in Australia, so a lot of eyes are on this project to see how this will operate. It's worth mentioning that there's these other projects, battery projects, going on in Canada. I'm only highlighting a few. We've got a 20 megawatt going in near Grand Prairie, and ENMAX, which if you're not familiar, is the electrical utility in Calgary in southern Alberta. They're also installing a 10 megawatt system, not necessarily tied to a renewable energy. ENMAX is actually installing this 10 megawatt system next to their Crossfield natural gas generator. So if that's not a signal, I don't know what is, that a company is installing this energy storage next to their fossil fuel generating station to help that station be economical and provide the power that it needs to. That's a great signal to say that battery technology is really on the forefront. In fact, here's a quote by Chris Joy. He's the Vice President of Business Operations of ENMAX. He was quoted in the Calgary Herald just earlier this month saying, "The energy sector is undergoing a period of transformation and battery storage is at the forefront of that." So just thinking about this quote, this is the Vice President of Business Operations from ENMAX. ENMAX does have a small solar component, but they're not focused on that. They know that battery technology, no matter what generating source, is at the forefront of this transformation. So any of you that are sitting there watching and thinking about, oh, what industry am I interested in? What should I get into? I've talked a lot about wind, solar, hydro, but the big up and coming industry right now is battery storage. We're designing bigger and more efficient wind turbines. We're finding more and more sites potentially to install hydropower. We're still designing and building out our solar energy infrastructure. But all of these, especially wind and solar, are dependent on this battery storage technology. And a few of these sites that I've talked about today demonstrate that not only is it green, but it's economical as well. These batteries are serving multiple purposes to not only enabling more green energy development, but conditioning our electrical grid to make it more reliable and cheaper for their customers. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I flew through it a little fast. I see I'm about 10 minutes ahead of schedule. Hopefully that gives us more time to start answering some questions. Before we get into that, just want to again give a big thank you to everyone that helped help build this presentation. Big thanks to both the ELCE Calgary and the ELCE Carleton clubs. I've been interacting with both of them and their leadership over the last few weeks. Really, thank you so much to those clubs. You guys are the next generation of energy leaders. And I really hope that I can build this organization to enable you to see the clean energy future that you want. At this time, if you're joining us from YouTube, please feel free to stick around. I will be going through some questions from the audience. I'll be reading out the questions, so it's still informational for you. However, again, I may not have time to interact or address the questions in the YouTube stream. So, final word, just a reminder that ELCE, we're a new not-for-profit corporation. We've got amazing sponsorship today from Skyfire Energy and Baywa Renewable Energy. If you're interested in our organization, if you'd like to make a donation, please contact us. Or if you're a young and up-and-coming clean energy advocate, please get in touch with us. We're here to help you. Whether you're a high school student who wants to learn more about clean energy and wants your teachers to teach you, whether you're a university student and you want to start your solar energy club or clean energy club, or if maybe you're a young professional already in the industry or in some industry and we're thinking about doing a transition. All of those categories, we're here to help you. So please reach out to us at our email there or on our website at elce.ca. Thank you very much. And I'm going to start our question period. Please bear with me while I start to look at some of our top questions. Great. So our first question that I'm seeing on our question list, someone has asked, what is the capacity of offshore wind in Canada? And the quick answer is 0. We have several projects that are in development or that are being thought about, but currently Canada does not have offshore wind resources. Correction, we have the resource, we just haven't built it out yet. So keep a lookout for some new offshore wind projects going up in Canada very shortly. Just looking now at some other questions on from our Zoom participants. I see a question here. How is China overcoming energy storage issues, especially considering their large global capacity? That's a great question. You might think, wow, China has 32% of global solar capacity. One of the quick answers to that is to say you have to think about their demand. China is a massive country when it comes to population, but also means a massive country when it comes to energy demand. What you see in terms of China's development of solar energy is that likely they haven't needed to produce a lot of battery technology yet. Even though they dominate the global market, that percentage of what they're generating is likely a very small percentage of what they're actually using. And you can calculate this based on either solar or wind or a combination. There's an equation to figure out what is the maximum amount of you can utilize before it becomes an issue and you need storage. I've seen figures somewhere around 20 to 30%. But if you think about it, even at 20%, China is nowhere near covering 20% of their energy with solar. So although they have a large market share, they also have a massive customer base. We're hopefully and likely going to see China start to develop their own battery solutions, but that's why you probably don't see it right now. All right, just looking at some other questions from our audience here, is battery storage viable for colder climate countries like Canada? As well, do benefits outweigh the environmental effects of recycling these batteries? That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. First of all, in colder climates, yes, typically batteries do not operate as well. I know firsthand how battery technologies like lead acid really have an issue when it comes to cold temperatures. It's one of the major hurdles if you're trying to install an off-grid system in Canada, is keeping your battery room warm, making sure that those batteries don't freeze. Just like your car battery, if you leave it in the cold and it freezes, it's gonna die. If we think about lithium-ion technologies or some of these other technologies, honestly, I don't have the information right now about how they are affected by the cold temperatures. So thanks for asking that question. It's actually very interesting and something that I'll make a note to look into and maybe answer for you during our next webinar. The next part of your question, though, is do the benefits outweigh the environmental effects of recycling these batteries? And really, the issue of recycling comes up a lot when it comes to these renewable technologies. Recycling is a major issue, and that's because when you compare renewable energy to standard fossil fuel-based or nuclear energy, what we see is a much larger amount of material that's needed. If you look at a 1 gigawatt solar plant compared to a 1 gigawatt nuclear plant, the nuclear plant takes a lot longer to build, probably a lot more concrete, but the solar plant is going to be absolutely massive, using tons of aluminum, silicon, and a lot of other kind of small amounts of harmful materials. Now, your question is more about batteries. And the short answer is I'm pretty sure that industry is not matured yet. And the reason is that we haven't installed a lot of these lithium-ion battery packs such that recycling is really an issue at this point. However, what I can say is that other industries are starting to pop up in terms of recycling other types of renewable technologies. One in particular is wind turbines. Those turbine blades that you see are not made of metal. They're actually made of either carbon fiber or some other synthetic fibrous materials. Really tough to recycle those types of materials, but I was just informed of a new firm that's actually taking it on to recycle all the components of a wind turbine. So the short answer, I guess, is that there are certainly significant environmental effects of both producing and recycling batteries. However, right now, at the scale that they're being produced and installed is not a major issue. But in the future, just like recycling solar and wind is starting to become a mainstream thing, I would hope and expect to see battery recycling on a large scale start to pop up maybe within the next 5 or 10 years. All right, we've got a few more questions here. Really great questions that are being asked. I almost feel like I'm in my classroom answering the questions of my students, one of my favorite things to do. We're looking at the next question here. What are your thoughts on recent news articles being published about recycling challenges faced by solar farms, as well as existing installed panels reaching end of life? Yeah, great question. However, I've touched on that already. There are certainly recycling challenges when it comes to solar energy. Right now, the way that solar is produced still has trace amounts of cadmium, gallium, things that are pretty harmful to our environment. We're seeing a lot of industries pop up, or at least being talked about in terms of recycling that product. And really, we're not really at the stage where there's a significant amount that needs to be recycled. Solar energy solar panels in general typically come with a 25-year warranty. Most systems intend to operate even past that 25-year horizon. So what we're seeing right now in 2020 is potentially some solar energy systems back from the 90s being decommissioned. But if you look back at my graphs about solar energy capacity back in the 90s, it's very, very small. So my thoughts about recycling solar is that this will become a major industry, that both the producers and users of solar energy will start to build their own industries to recoup and recycle the cells and the panels that they produce. But great question, thank you. One of the last questions here is about solar thermal projects. It says, why don't we have more solar thermal projects if these have higher efficiencies than solar PV? Great question. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that about 10 years ago, Italy was dominating the market with their solar thermal plants. For those of you that aren't familiar, solar thermal generates electricity in a different way. It actually uses the heat of solar energy to heat up a fluid to drive a steam turbine like a traditional thermal energy plant, say like a coal plant or what have you. So why don't we have more of those? Why don't we have more solar thermal projects? And the answer is mainly about cost. We saw a ton of these solar thermal projects go up 5, 10, 15 years ago. And that was when the price of solar PV was still quite high. What we're seeing right now in recent developments is that the cost of solar PV has plummeted. Maybe in another presentation, I can show you exactly what those figures are like. But over the last 10 years, the price of producing a solar PV cell has dropped dramatically. Off the top of my head, I would say, close to 100-fold decrease in price. So the quick answer is it's all about economics. Even though solar thermal potentially could have higher efficiencies in terms of converting the available sunlight into electricity, it comes down to what it costs to produce that electricity. There's still certainly sites where solar thermal makes sense. Maybe if you have a reduced footprint that you're dealing with. But my expectation, unless there's some other major innovation in the industry, that we're not going to see a lot, if any, solar thermal plants being developed in the future. All right, I'm coming to my last question on the Zoom webinar. Thanks again for everyone that stuck around to ask these questions. The last question is, are the RV, marine, and small off-grid users considered to be behind the meter consumers? And that's a great question. How do you distinguish that? I mentioned earlier in the presentation about behind the meter, which is more small scale residential or commercial systems versus utility systems. So in terms of RV, marine, and small off-grid, the quick answer is that those industries are small enough that they're not even registered on most of our indicators. Yes, there's tons of RV solar, solar on boats, and I've had really great experience working on a few off-grid houses here in Alberta. The quick answer would be yes, I would consider those behind the meter. We're not going to see a lot of utility scale off-grid stuff. Doesn't really make sense. So my answer would be that yes, these types of systems are considered to be behind the meter. Great question though. All right. Thanks again for joining us. If you're still chimed in, thank you so much for sticking around for the question and answer period. If you're still joining us from YouTube, please consider next time to join our Zoom channel to allow you to ask questions either ahead of time, which I've answered during the presentation, or during the presentation just now. It goes a long way to help support our organization. But at this point, just another thank you to everyone for contributing to this webinar. This was our first time doing this. I hope you enjoyed it, and please send your feedback. Let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. For those of you joining us on Zoom, when I exit this presentation, you should be sent to a poll to help us understand how you found the presentation. Okay, with that, I'm going to sign off. I'm Brodie Yyelland from ELCE, wishing you all a very happy and renewable future. Thank you.